A veteran unexpectedly meets his dog again, who once fought by his side in dangerous missions, now tied up in a corner of a rundown market. But its thin body and tired eyes no longer recognize him. What happens next? Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into this story together. James Reynolds, a 37-year-old former soldier, walks slowly through the dusty paths of the town's market, each step feeling heavy from the struggles he'd carried since leaving the army 2 years ago. In the chaotic atmosphere of rickety stalls and hawkers hawking their wares, the air was filled with the smell of grilled meat and dust. He passed tables of trinkets and produce, barely registering the noise until a faint whimper cut through the clamor. At the edge of the market, near a gnarled tree, he saw a large dog tied with a frayed rope, a German shepherd, black and tan fur matted and dull. The animal's frame was gaunt, its posture hunched as a gruff vendor barked at passers-by, trying to sell it off. James froze, his breath catching. The dog's weary eyes met his, dulled by exhaustion and fear, but there was something achingly familiar in their depths. It couldn't be. Thor? The vendor noticed his stare and grumbled. "You want him?" $50. Can't keep feeding the mutt. He's too skittish." James's heart thudded as he stepped closer, ignoring the man's words. The dog flinched, pulling back against the rope. But James knelt anyway, his voice barely a whisper. "Thor, is that you, boy?" There was no spark of recognition, just a low growl of distrust. Yet James knew this was his partner, lost and broken, just like him. Even so, James felt his heart race. He would recognize that dog anywhere. "Thor," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the market's din. The German shepherd lifted his head slowly, his matted fur shifting as he stared at James. But there was no warmth in his gaze, no wagging tail, no flicker of recognition, just a hollow, wary look, as if James were another stranger in the crowd. "He doesn't recognize me," James murmured, stepping back from the tree where Thor was tethered. His chest tightened, a sharp pang of loss cutting through him. But as he locked eyes with Thor for a few more seconds, one truth burned clear. He couldn't walk away from this reunion. James stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away. Thor, the German shepherd, who once radiated energy and resolve, now seemed a mere shadow of the partner he'd known. His eyes, once bright with life, were now clouded and distant, reflecting a world of hardship. The scars on his back leg and one torn ear stood out starkly against his dull coat. Battlefield marks James knew too well. But beyond the physical, there was a deeper wound, an invisible weight of trauma James felt mirrored in his own soul. The vendor, noticing James's lingering stare, snorted impatiently. "Look, he's $50. Take him or leave him. Found him wandering a back road a state over. Too jumpy for me, doesn't trust nobody." He shrugged, kicking at the dirt, then squinted at James. "You know this mutt or what?" James nodded slowly, his voice a barely audible whisper over the fading chatter of the market. "He was my partner, my best friend." For a moment, he drowned in a flood of memories. The grueling training where they'd forged an unbreakable trust. The perilous missions where Thor had saved his life more than once. And the endless nights when the dog's steady presence had held him together. And now there he was, inches from Thor. Yet the German shepherd stared back as if he were a stranger. The vendor snorted, tugging at the frayed rope around Thor's neck. "Well, you want him or not? I ain't got all day." James knelt slowly, extending a hand toward the tethered dog. "Hey, buddy, it's me, James," he said, his voice trembling but gentle. Thor tilted his head slightly, ears twitching as if puzzling over the sound, but his body stayed rigid, a low growl rumbling in his throat. James swallowed hard, the ache in his chest deepening. He knew this wouldn't be simple. The vendor shrugged, loosening the knot with a grunt. "Take him for a bit, see if he bites. $50 if you keep him." James nodded without a second thought, his eyes never leaving Thor. When the rope came off, Thor didn't bolt. He just stood there, wary and still, sniffing the air as the market crowd thinned. James watched every twitch of his ears, every tense shift of his frame, searching for a glimpse of the dog he'd known. As the sun sank below the horizon, Painting the mountains in deep amber, James made up his mind. He turned to the vendor, voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "I'll buy it. I'll take him home." The words carried a steely resolve, an echo of the loyalty they'd once shared. He knew Thor wasn't the only one who needed saving. Maybe this was the start of redemption for them both. The drive to James's house was cloaked in an uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of the truck's engine. Thor sprawled in the back, slumped on a worn blanket James had tossed in for him after leaving the market. The German shepherd's gaze stayed glued to the window, avoiding James entirely, his breath fogging the glass in shallow bursts. James stole glances through the rearview mirror, searching for any hint of what churned in the dog's mind. The sting of rejection gnawed at him, but he understood. Both of them, hardened by war, bore scars that made connection feel like a battlefield of its own. When they pulled up to James's small property on the town's edge, the sky had darkened to a deep indigo. The house stood modest and solitary, its wide yard framed by a handful of trees rustling in the evening breeze. James eased open the truck door and called softly, "Come on, Thor." The dog didn't budge at first, his eyes darting over the unfamiliar terrain. After a tense pause, he slid down, paws hitting the ground with deliberate caution, each step measured as if expecting an ambush. James guided him toward the front door, pushing it open slowly. "Welcome home, boy," he said, forcing a lightness into his tone, though doubt shadowed his words. Thor stepped inside but froze just past the threshold, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. His stance screamed suspicion, ears flicking at every creak of the old house, as if danger lurked in the stillness. James, determined to ease him in, had rigged up a corner of the living room with a folded blanket, a couple of bowls for food and water, and a cheap toy bone he'd grabbed from a gas station on the way. "That's your spot, Thor," he said, gesturing toward it. But Thor didn't move, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond James, ignoring the offer entirely. James let out a quiet sigh, the weight of frustration settling heavier on his shoulders. As James was preparing something to eat, memories of Thor flooded back unbidden. Days when the German shepherd would bound toward him, brimming with vitality and devotion. That dog was a ghost of himself now, broken in ways James knew too intimately. He glanced at Thor, still rooted to the same spot in the entryway, staring blankly into the distance. "I get it, buddy. I'm lost too," he muttered, more to the air than to the dog. That night, James propped the bedroom door open, a silent invitation for Thor to feel safe enough to draw near. As he flicked off the lights, the faint tap of paws echoed on the hardwood. Thor didn't approach but settled just outside the doorway, a cautious silhouette against the dark. James smiled faintly in the shadows. It was a tiny gesture, but to him it whispered of something stirring. The next morning, James woke up to the soft sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. Thor was sitting near the door, ears perked, silently watching him. For a moment, James felt a spark of hope. Maybe something familiar was coming back to the dog's mind. "Good morning, Thor," James said, stretching and forcing a smile. But Thor turned his head, retreating stiffly to his corner by the living room. Determined to rebuild their connection, James spent much of the day trying to interact with Thor. He tossed a scuffed tennis ball he'd found in the truck toward Thor, but the dog didn't flinch. He set a bowl of kibble beside him, though Thor only edged toward it once James had stepped away. Every reach for closeness met a wall of quiet resistance. The rejection stung, but James saw beyond it: fear, mistrust, a pain too deep to name. That afternoon, James decided to try something different. He grabbed a worn military vest he had kept in an old box in the closet. It was the same vest he wore during missions with Thor. As he put it on, the familiar smell of sand, sweat, and the battlefield hit him. "Let's see if you remember this, boy," he said, taking the vest to the backyard where Thor was. Thor glanced toward James with a flicker of curiosity, tilting his head slightly as the man moved through the yard. For a split second, James thought he saw a glimmer of the old Thor, a whisper of recognition. He stepped back, crouching low to give Thor room to close the gap if he chose. The German shepherd edged forward, nostrils twitching as he sniffed the air, but then he froze, retreating to the fence with his tail tucked tight. James let out a quiet breath, the brief flare of hope dimming once more. That night, James sat on the porch steps, the chill of the evening settling in as he watched Thor sprawl in the yard, gazing up at the star-strewn sky. "I'm not giving up on you," he said, his voice carrying into the stillness like a vow. "You never quit on me when I needed you most, and I'm not quitting now." He knew it was a tall order, but he felt their bond lingering, smothered beneath layers of pain and time. As the wind picked up, James rose, leaving the back door ajar, and headed to bed. Hours later, a faint scrape of paws jolted him awake. At the foot of the bed, Thor lay curled, eyes half shut in the dimness. James stayed silent, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The gap between them was narrowing, a fragile thread of trust sparking his resolve. The next few days brought glimmers of progress, like fissures in the wall of wariness Thor had built. On Monday morning, a steady drizzle soaked the yard as James wrestled with a tarp to cover a pile of firewood. He caught Thor watching from the fence line, head cocked, rain streaking his fur. The dog's tail hung low, but a quiet interest flickered in his gaze. James paused, brushing wet hair from his eyes, and called out lightly, "Want to lend a paw, boy?" Thor didn't budge, but his eyes held steady, locked on James through the gray haze. Later that day, as the drizzle tapered off, James wandered the yard with Thor trailing at a distance. He plucked a soggy stick from the mud and flicked it a few feet ahead, not expecting much. To his quiet surprise, Thor shuffled forward a step or two, paused as if caught off guard, then slunk back to his spot by the fence. James cracked a small smile. "So you still know the game, huh?" "Just playing hard to get." Though Thor's response was timid, that flicker of movement felt like a crack in the ice. On Tuesday, James decided to take him for a walk. Thor's old ID tag was still stored away, so James cleaned it and attached it to the new collar. "Let's go for a walk," he said, adjusting the leash. Thor hesitated when James opened the gate, looking outside as if the world beyond the fence was hostile. Still, with a gentle tug, James managed to convince him to walk. During the walk, Thor seemed tense, always alert. He was constantly sniffing the air and kept his body stiff, as though expecting imminent danger. James noticed this and spoke calmly. "You don't need to be like that, boy. We're safe here." He knew those words didn't mean much to Thor, but he hoped that over time the calm tone would start to make a difference. As they were heading home, something unexpected happened. James was taking off Thor's leash when the dog approached and sniffed his hand. James stood still, feeling his heart race. "That's it, Thor," he murmured, trying not to show too much emotion. He didn't move as Thor kept exploring his scent for a few seconds before pulling away again. For James, that small gesture felt like a sign that something inside Thor was starting to change. That evening, as James clattered around the kitchen, throwing together a simple meal, Thor sprawled on the faded rug just beyond the doorway. It wasn't a plea for closeness, but the nearness alone buoyed James's spirits, a sign they might be inching towards something familiar. He glanced at Thor and murmured, "We're getting there, huh, boy?" "Friends again, maybe." Thor didn't stir, but his gaze softened, less shadowed, as if a faint echo of the man who'd once been his world was brushing against his mind. Have you ever felt a bond with an animal rekindle after hard times? Drop your stories in the comments. We'd love to hear them. It was a gray morning, and the mist covered the yard like a veil. James woke up early, as he always did, but found Thor already awake, sitting by the living room window. The German Shepherd was staring out, as if lost in thought. James edged closer, every step measured, knowing each moment with Thor tested his patience. "Seeing something out there, boy?" he asked softly, not expecting a reply. After a quiet breakfast, James decided to shift the day's rhythm. The rain had stopped, but the ground outside was slick, so he grabbed a tarp from the shed, aiming to secure the woodpile before the next downpour hit. He stepped into the yard where Thor lingered near the fence, eyes tracking the mist. Thor watched James wrestle with the tarp, his body tensing slightly as the wind snapped the fabric. He sniffed the damp air, ears flicking, as if sifting through the scents carried on the breeze, something distant, unplaceable. For a moment he shifted forward, paws pressing into the mud, then eased back, settling into his wary stillness. James paused, tarp half secured, and watched him, the quiet pull of possibility hanging between them. James watched in silence, tracing the faint tension in Thor's frame. You feel it too, don't you? He murmured, a quiet ache in his voice. That day carried a different weight. During lunch, Thor lingered nearer, shadowing James's steps around the kitchen. For the first time, he nosed at a scrap of bread James offered from his hand. James's breath caught, but he tamped down the rush of feeling, keeping his movements slow and steady. The German shepherd nibbled cautiously, eyes flicking up to meet James's, a fragile thread of trust weaving between them. Later, James slumped on the porch steps, rubbing his hands together against the damp chill. He chuckled softly to himself, recalling restless nights in the field when Thor would nudge him awake. Restless and stubborn, demanding attention even amidst chaos. You haven't changed that much, have you? He said, half to the air. He stretched out a hand toward Thor, who sat a few feet off, but didn't push closer. The dog's ears twitched, tracking him, though he stayed rooted in the wet grass. That night, Thor edged closer, curling up just beyond the bedroom door as James settled into bed. The veteran felt the gap between them thinning, not just in space, but in something raw and unspoken. They were both still shackled by their wounds, yet now it seemed they were carrying the load together, step by halting step. Before flicking off the light, James glanced at Thor and whispered, "We're getting there, partner." Almost there. The sun struggled through a heavy sky that morning, casting a muted glow over the soggy backyard as James geared up for another day with Thor. The rain had paused, but the ground was still a mess of mud and puddles, so he decided to tackle a practical task: check fence after recent heavy rain. He hoped the routine of moving together might stir something in Thor, something locked deep beneath the weight of their shared past. "Let's take it easy, boy," James said, slogging toward the yard's edge, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder to patch a loose post. Thor trailed behind, keeping his distance, eyes sharp on James's every step. James walked along the fence, checking each post, when his foot hit a slippery patch of mud. He lost his balance, arms waving, and slid down a small ditch hidden in the grass, a runoff channel full of water from the rain. "Crap!" he muttered, grabbing at the muddy sides, his ankle twisting painfully under him. Thor stood still at the top, ears up, watching James struggle to climb out. For a second, the dog didn't move. Then, out of nowhere, he jumped in, paws sinking into the sludge. He clamped his teeth onto James's sleeve and pulled hard, growling as he tugged, dragging James bit by bit until he crawled out, panting onto dry ground. James felt a chill run through him as he sat there, covered in mud and breathing hard. "You did it, boy," he said in a rough voice, looking at Thor. The German shepherd stepped back, shaking off the water, and locked eyes with James, his gaze bright in a way James hadn't seen since their war days. Something flickered there, a spark of the old spirit, like Thor suddenly knew who James was again. James's throat got tight, his eyes stinging, but he held it together, staying still. He didn't want to scare Thor off with how much it hit him. That moment broke down a wall between them. For the rest of the day, Thor stayed near James, following him around the house in a calm way he hadn't done before. When James flopped onto the couch, mud still stuck to his boots from the morning's fall, Thor lay down on the floor next to him, something new since that wild day at the market. It wasn't about games or stuff from the past bringing them closer. It was Thor slowly letting his guard down, letting James back into his life. That night, as James washed the dirt off his hands, he couldn't shake the memory of the ditch. Thor grabbing his sleeve, pulling him out with all he had. He didn't need a photo. Their connection was back, strong and real. Rain pounded the backyard as thunder growled far off, turning the gray sky dark and wet. James stepped onto the porch with a coffee mug, watching Thor stand at the edge, sniffing the storm. The German shepherd looked lost in it, lightning reflecting in his eyes. The rain's beat tugging at something inside him. James moved closer, keeping his voice low against the wind. "You always like storms, huh?" he said, mostly to himself. Thor turned his head slow, meeting James's eyes. For the first time since that dusty market, something changed. Less of the old wariness, more of a cautious spark, a hint of the dog who used to know him so well. James's heart beat faster, a quiet excitement stirring inside. They still had a long way to go, with plenty of baggage weighing them down. But moments like this, the muddy save, this calm togetherness, kept him going. Thor didn't back off, just stood there, rain dripping down his fur like he was feeling out the space between them. The moment felt alive, unguarded, with the storm still raging outside. The rain hit harder, its steady thump reminding them both of the ditch from earlier. James didn't try any tricks or grab anything. He just stayed on the porch, letting the silence do the talking. Thor stood still for a second, then took a small, shaky step toward James before stopping, ears flicking in the wet breeze. James held his breath, hoping for that old flash of trust. But Thor's eyes clouded, a bit of uncertainty creeping in. He lowered his head, like he was fighting something deep down. James let out a slow breath, calming himself. He didn't want to rush things, not after Thor had already saved him from that muddy ditch. "It's okay, partner," he said, his voice soft and warm. "We'll go slow." As the rain got heavier, James slipped inside to grab a dry blanket in a scratched-up water bowl, placing them near the porch steps without saying anything. He sat down on the floor a little ways from Thor, not too close, just enough to let the dog know he was there and wasn't leaving. Little by little, Thor relaxed, lying down on the wet porch and sneaking quick glances at James. As night fell over the house, Thor did something surprising. He scooted closer, his breathing loud in the quiet. He stopped just inches from James, who stayed perfectly still, giving Thor his space. The German Shepherd sniffed the air carefully, like he was checking if it was safe to trust again. Each sniff a small step for a dog who'd lost that feeling long ago. Then slowly, Thor nudged James's hand with his nose, a quick touch that made James's heart pound. "You're coming back, boy," he whispered, his voice shaky with emotion. He didn't move, afraid to ruin the moment, just waited, letting Thor decide. When Thor pulled back, James felt a wave of relief and hope. It was a small victory, but to him, it felt like a big welcome home. The morning started with birds singing outside, but inside the house, something calmer was happening. Thor stood in the middle of the room, looking right at James, who held an old leash in one hand and smiled with hope. "Today's our day, buddy," James said, his voice full of excitement. He'd picked a special place, a park nearby where they used to hang out during breaks from training. It wasn't about testing Thor or bringing back old memories. It was just a way to see how much they'd grown since that muddy ditch. On the drive, Thor looked more relaxed than James had ever seen since the market. He stretched out in the back seat, sticking his nose out the half-open window, letting the wind blow through his fur. James peeked at him in the rearview mirror, feeling proud and relieved. After weeks of hard work, he'd brought back the dog who used to mean everything to him, and this trip felt like a big step forward. "Feels like the old days, huh?" James said quietly, not expecting an answer. At the park, James took off the leash and let Thor run free, without any toys or games. The German Shepherd stopped for a second, sniffing the fresh air, then dashed across the grass like he couldn't wait to move. They spent hours wandering through the trees, just enjoying being together, as if all the tough years had faded away. James saw bits of the Thor he remembered, but he knew they'd both changed because of their scars. They weren't exactly the same as before, but they were tough enough to start something new together. As the afternoon turned to evening, James sat down on an old park bench, the sun setting low and warm. Thor lay next to him on the grass, resting his head on James's leg. James looked out at the horizon fading away, feeling a calm peace fill his chest. "I said I wouldn't give up, Thor," he whispered, gently rubbing the dog's wet fur. For the first time in years, James felt like a part of him was back. Thor wasn't just a memory. He was proof of everything they'd been through and fought to get back. On the drive home under a darkening sky, James knew the future wasn't clear, but that was okay. They'd tackle it together. Thor, with his toughness and spirit, had found his way back to James, and James had learned that patience, love, and determination could heal even the deepest wounds. They were a team again, ready for whatever came next. We're on an exciting journey to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means a lot to us. Like, share, and subscribe to be part of this story